This is Tall Tale TV, your podcast for sci-fi and fantasy short stories. Of Tyrants and Teakettles by Lesley Herron. Chapter 21, Helichrysum. For the last time. Chester paused, pushing his forehead against his fingers. I can't understand you when you're both shouting at me. He lowered his hand and looked over at his two uninvited guests. Well, sit down and start over. He gestured with a forceful wave. One at a time, please. You're as bad as the children. Piper folded her arms over her chest. I said we found your way in. Chester's eyebrows pulled up and together in a moment of skepticism. Really? With less than 6 hours left on the clock? Forgive me if I find that hard to believe. He scooped up a crystal glass between his fingers and brought it neatly to his lips. He took a long drink of the red liquid before returning the cup to the table. Vel jabbed a finger towards the ceiling. Up at the air docks, there's an entrance to an underground, so to speak, network of shady dealings and corrupt businesses, a black market. He grinned. Your ticket into the aviary district is right above us. Chester's smile fell into a flat line. How did you come to discover this market? Because you told us to? Vel let his hands fall to his side as confusion curled his features. Yes, quite. My simple friend, allow me to elaborate. I was informed? Chester paused and looked over his shoulder. That you two were making a run for it. I said that was impossible. You would never leave Atticus. So let me rephrase the question. What were you doing at the air docks? Vel followed Chester's gaze to see a familiar man standing in the corner. No longer filthy, but sporting a few deep purple bruises, was the same rickshaw driver that had followed them earlier. He was nursing a bleeding sore on his elbow and offered the cyborg a hateful sneer. Just because we ditched a pervert doesn't mean we were running. Chester scowled. No, but it doesn't explain why you were at the docks either. Piper pushed Vel aside, stepping before Chester. I'll admit it. I was running. But what does it matter? If I hadn't, you never would have found your inn. This guard led us up for a stack of cash, and we nosed about for an hour or two. She pulled a rough sketch of the market she had scribbled onto a tattered fragment of newspaper. They built it in the abandoned work tunnels left over from when they made Avis Isle. It's directly beneath the trade center of the city, and nearly every business has a trapdoor leading down. Vel nodded. Apparently, the rich don't like paying taxes on their goods, and neither do the merchants. By offering some cash to get in, they're able to bypass the customs check and avoid the taxes on both ends. Chester steepled his fingers. And, no doubt, acquire items of a less legal nature. Intriguing. Piper jumped in, a grin forming in the corner of her lips. And all you have to do is replace the guard or hire him. You got your in, and we got our out. Lost deep in thought, Chester stroked his chin slowly. You do make a compelling case. He pulled his focus back to the two in front of him. He couldn't formulate an argument that would allow them to remain in his employ. His protégé was adept at getting what she wanted, and the man provided the muscle to get to the truth. He sighed and waved them off with a hand. Very well. Should this market truly exist, you can consider this repayment for your debts. He turned to the rickshaw driver. Matthew, make your way to this guard, verify their story, and determine what style of negotiation would work best. I'll expect your report by morning. He paused for a moment and added as an afterthought, and try not to get mobbed this time. Matthew scowled and stalked out of the room, shouldering his way past Vel. Chester smiled, watching the imposing figure disappear behind a towering aisle of books. Don't mind him. In all honesty, I think the experience was good for him. Humbling, you might say. Piper squinted at him, scrutinizing that ever-present smile.
Just to be clear, this means my brother's loans are nullified? He's no longer in danger of being exposed?
But of course, Piper. I am a man of my word. You have given me a healthy and functioning black market just beneath the High Inquisitor's feet. I couldn't ask for a better gift. Your brother is free to go about his daily life. And your companion here no longer has a debt to pay.
Chester leaned over and scooped up his wine glass once again, eyeing Vel's cybernetic arm.
Although, if you ever find yourself in need of money... Piper gave the man one last look before swiveling on her heel and tugging at her friend's coat sleeve.
Come on, Gramps, let's go.
Chester watched them leave, the smile on his face never wavering. Do return should you find yourselves in need of a favor. My rates aren't unreasonable. Piper laughed a little as she gave the cyborg a playful slug on the shoulder.
I can't believe we managed to pull that off, old man.
She took in a deep breath of air and smiled. The day seemed brighter and less polluted than it had before they entered the library. Vel gave a careful glance over his shoulder and then around at the abandoned shops. I don't know. That felt too easy. Can we trust him? They stepped out of the empty cobblestone street, and he couldn't help the dread of being so exposed. He looked up and down the road, squinting against the glare from a few of the window shops. Piper tucked her hands into her pockets and gave him a light-hearted shrug.
Look, I know Chester can be a bit of a bastard.
Believe me, I know. She clicked her tongue against her teeth as she gave a quick roll of the eyes before turning on her heel to face the approaching intersection.
But despite all that, he is a man of his word. That's all he's really got, innit?
Vel sighed. He wanted to trust what she said, and he desperately wanted to believe Chester, but it's hard to put faith in a man surrounded by luxury in a den of squalor. He pulled back to let a group of passing slum dwellers rush by before returning to her side. So, what now?
Well, we might have to make another trip back up to Avis District. We're still down a fair amount of cash. But...
She pulled out the square of newspaper with her crudely drawn map of the black market.
We now know which shops might have excess coin lying around.
Another throng of people pushed by them before they pulled to a stop at the base of the bridge. Vel looked around, noticing an excess of people exiting their huts and hovels to race one another to meet up with the growing crowd. What's going on? Piper looked up from her map, realizing for the first time the sheer amount of people around her. She shook her head as more and more citizens began to spill from their makeshift homes.
I don't know. I've never seen this many slum dwellers out at one time.
She squinted through the people, scanning the horizon for a speck of red.
They better be careful or the street sweepers might catch 'em.
Vel reached out a hand and grabbed a hold of a young boy trying to dart by them. Hey, kid, what's going on here? The young boy looked up at the man, darned in a long red coat with unease. He glanced over at the girl beside him and relaxed.
Gosh, mister, I'm surprised you haven't heard.
He pulled his attention away to point to a spot where the others were gathering just beyond the bridge.
The High Inquisitor has kept his promise. He's brought down food from them rich folks up in the Aerial District, and he's given it to us.
Vel noted the gaunt appearance of the boy and released the hold he had on his shirt sleeve. The boy scampered off without a second glance. Vel sidled up to Piper, their respective curiosities piqued. And you didn't believe me. I told you he wasn't all that bad. Piper scowled.
This is something I gotta see for myself.
Vel followed the girl as she stepped back into the flow of people. You mentioned money? Why do you need the money now? Piper tucked her map back into her vest pocket as she walked.
I wasn't kidding around when I said I wanted to take my brother away from the university and the Inquisitor.
The last word fell from her mouth, coated in venom.
I still want to get him on that airship and out of this city.
Despite his best efforts to keep them anchored, Vel soon found himself and Piper being swept up with the crowd of slum dwellers. It wasn't until they hit the arch of the bridge that he was able to pull them to one of the sides. We're not on the chopping block anymore, kid. I'm all for it if you want to move away from this place, but there's no rush. And besides, without your brother, Elias has no chance of getting the portal machine working."
Piper's face hardened. "I don't want my brother around that monster any longer."
Vel shook his head. "He's not a monster."
"I just don't understand why you can't see what kind of person he really is. He's not a good person, and I don't want my brother around him."
"Not a good person?"
Vel looked around at the people returning from the other side of the bridge. They had large smiles on their faces and varying amounts of food in their hands. Some individuals had only what they could carry, while larger families were given baskets of food to feed everyone.
"I'll admit, he can be a bit intense, but look around. This is not the act of a bad person. Look at how happy they all are."
"Just because he gives out a bit of food after ignoring these people for years does not make him good. Just clever. He's still the same man that ordered the street sweepers to chuck the poor over the wall."
Vel sighed. "I told you earlier, he didn't know they were doing that. He was appalled when I told him what they did to you. He promised to get them to stop."
Piper's face fell into a somber expression, and she stopped cold in her tracks, causing Vel to bump into her. "Yeah, well, looks like he kept that promise too." She pointed at a spot just beyond the hungry crowd. Vel followed her finger until his eyes landed on a macabre sight displayed among the gleeful slum dwellers. In the middle of the crowd was a series of tables and carts where the food was being dispensed by guards. The familiar porcelain visages of comedy and tragedy stood out as they oversaw the event. And there, just beyond them, was a large metal rack that had been erected into what appeared to be a mass gallows. 12 bodies, all clad in military red, swung limp from the ropes around their necks. He recognized the large woman as the one he had spoken with on his first night inside the city walls, the leader of the street sweepers. And there, rotating on his noose, was a shorter man wearing a dog-faced mask. Grayson, one of the council, and presumably the man in charge of the street sweepers. "But I'm sure he was just being a bit intense."
Piper turned her gaze away as several slum dwellers laughed, poked, and prodded at the dead. Vel bit back on the bile rising in his throat. He chewed his tongue for a moment before finally settling on the words. "I agree, he went too far. But perhaps he was just trying to prevent what happened to you from happening to others."
Piper scoffed. "But killing people? That doesn't make any sense. Just sack the lot. You don't have to string them up in the middle of the street. But can't you see now why I want to get my brother away from him? He just killed 12 people. People who worked for him. What's to stop him from doing the same to Atticus?"
People were starting to stare and giving them a wide berth as they walked around them. Vel snorted a little as he felt his temper rising. "Your brother is different, and you know it."
"Exactly. He is different. He's got a kind soul, and I don't want to see it tarnished from exposure to that villain and his monstrous acts."
Piper moved a step away, setting her jaw in a firm, resounding gesture. "And if you do that, then I'm stranded here." Piper's lips curled back.
"It's all about you, innit?"
Vel could feel her gaze boring into him, but he pressed on. "Trust me, I know Elias. He'd never hurt Atticus."
"He's not your brother!"
The slum dwellers had come to a halt, watching their argument unfold. She even appeared to have caught the attention of comedy and tragedy. Deciding against making any farther scene, she turned her back on her friend and moved down to the other end of the bridge. She'd go the long way back to the hangar. Vel trotted up alongside her, pulling against her arm to get her to stop. "Listen!" Piper wrenched her arm free.
"No, you listen. That man is evil. You say you know him, but you've only just met him. I've lived in the city almost my whole life, and I've had to hide from his guards chasing me every waking moment and felt the wrath of those who work for him. I won't allow him to do the same to my brother."
Maybe if you weren't constantly breaking the law, you wouldn't feel like they were persecuting you.
And maybe if he hadn't ruined the city, I wouldn't have to.
Vel let out a frustrated sigh. I wouldn't expect someone like you to understand.
Piper reeled, his words cutting into her like a knife. Tears began to well up in her eyes, but she reached back and slapped him with as much strength as she could muster. Her open palm landed squarely on his cheek, leaving a red mark that would surely welt. She had trusted him, something she hadn't done since her parents left, and he had chosen a familiar face over her. Her amber eyes sparkled with tears as her voice quivered with rage. I may be a thief and a liar, but... She gestured back at the swinging bodies with her other hand. At least I ain't defending a murderer. Vel put his hands up.
That's not what I...
Save it! I don't care what you have to say anymore. I'm going to get my brother, and you can go and cozy up to yours! Piper spat at his feet as she stomped off, ducking down a side alley. Vel watched her disappear into the crowd and hung his head in defeat. Piper glanced over her shoulder to see if the cyborg was following her. He wasn't. She couldn't be sure if that made her happy, angry, or just sad. Thoughts were railing against the inside of her head, thrumming against her skull. After all this time, she thought he, of all people, could see the dangerous person the Inquisitor truly was. But it was apparent that all it would take to persuade him was a family resemblance. She continued to stomp along the dirt-covered cobblestones, her mind preoccupied with poisonous thoughts. She shoved past person after person in her attempts to reach the secondary bridge that crossed over the runoff river. Another sign of the abhorrent behavior from the university. A polluted waterway of sludge stemming from one end of the college cut a dividing line between the slums and the no-guard district. It was filled mostly with toxins, but sometimes debris from the college washed down with the oils and discarded chemicals. There were only a handful of bridges that connected the two, and she soon found her path blocked. Piper tried to move around the person, but they continued to step in front of her. Oi, come off it, mate. I've had a really trying day, and I'm in no... Her words died in her throat as she looked up to see the porcelain-carved mask of tragedy.
The High Inquisitor would like a word with you.
Of Tyrants and Teakettles is Book 2 of the ongoing Sci-Fantasy series by author Lesley Herron. Join us as the adventure unfolds, with new chapters releasing every few weeks.
It's Chester, sir. Ah, Ambrose. There you are. We were starting to worry. You look quite disheveled. Are you all right?
Yes, sir. Sorry, sir. I'm afraid I lost them, sir.
What? Vel and Piper? But that was hours ago. They made it back here before you did.
They did? Oh, I'm sorry, sir. I got held up and then I couldn't find them again.
Held up, you say?
Yes, sir. I was mugged by no less than 6 men. But I fought my way free in the end. It was horrifying.
6 men, you say? Indeed, that does sound harrowing. Well, no harm done. I'm glad you survived your encounter.
Thank you, sir. I'll be sure to find those men and give them a good thrashing for what they did.
Yes, good idea. You go do that. Oh, and by the way, Ambrose.
Yes, sir?
You still have lipstick all over your face.